I'm curious, looking at something like doctors, which is the most virtuous career perhaps I could think of. You imagine medical professionals, therefore, by the analogy that, or the idea that virtue would be critical in this pursuit of happiness, would be happy. And yet studies suggest that doctors are far from happy. Their burnout rates have spiked post-COVID. Healthcare workers, in many cases, are more likely to be depressed or suicidal than the general population. I know you're not an expert in psychology or the medical profession, but I do wonder how you square that virtuous life and its outcomes against the framers' ideas that doing good is happiness.
Well, I would resist the impulse to talk about virtue in the abstract. What's so striking about the framers is how practical they are, and disaggregating virtue into these virtues of the soul, avoiding the perturbations of the mind, as Cicero said, means that you could have a doctor who's dissatisfied by the burnout of work, but is successful in practicing mindfulness and calming his anxieties, or can have effective personal relationships with his kids, but is dissatisfied by health insurance. There's no such thing as a virtuous profession. It's very important to stress this is a radically empowering philosophy of self-mastery, and each individual has the opportunity on not only a daily but hourly basis to try to achieve that calm tranquility that defines self-mastery, which makes possible long-term happiness. And that's why it's also there's such connections to the Eastern traditions, and that idea that we are what we think in life shaped by the mind is so important. My dad, who died at 95 when I was finishing the book, was a great hypnotherapist of the 20th century, and he saw deep connections between the wisdom of hypnotherapy, that as we imagine ourselves to be, so shall we be, and the classical wisdom about virtuous self-mastery. And I think he would have emphasized that for each of us, whatever our profession is, we have the opportunity on not only a daily but hourly basis to achieve that calm self-mastery, regardless of what else is going around about us in the world and in our professions.
Right. I want to ask about that, this idea of kind of regardless of whatever is going on around us, because that kind of stoicism, I don't know, Roger, I'm curious to explore your perspective on it, because, one way of looking at what's happening to medical professionals, but just anyone in a very challenging position, is around pain and pleasure. So how do you think those factor in?
Well, I think virtue and pleasure are quite different. Mm-hmm. So I have to admit that a vicious person could live a very enjoyable and happy life, and equally a virtuous person might be very unhappy. And I take it that doctors are in that category. I was struck there by Jeffrey's mention of calm tranquility, because that brings out again how I suspect that when it comes to how one should live one's life, we may not disagree very much. In that, I take it that most people we count as virtuous, or many people that we count as virtuous, would live lives of calm tranquility. It's just that you need more, so doctors are not racked by guilt. They're quite happy with what they're doing. It's just that there are other sources of happiness which are not available to them, like sufficient recreation.
So you're saying it's kind of virtue might be, or is correlated with, but is not the only cause of, or not the only path to, is your argument. Jeffrey really makes a case, I think, relying on historical definitions of the pursuit of happiness, that, and really these Federalist Papers as a kind of manual to public happiness. So a state built on virtuous and happy citizens would be a virtuous state. I'm curious, Roger, if you can imagine an alternative hypothetical, or make a case that a nation might be better off, might be happier, if its citizens focused on feeling good rather than doing good, and not feeling good in that instant gratification extreme version of it, but thinking about pleasure and pain.
Well, I think I could make a case for that. I mean, it has been made by people like Richard Layard and others in recent years. And in fact, Keir Starmer, who is quite likely to be our next Prime Minister in the UK, has said he will judge every policy not only by its effect on our gross domestic product, but also by its effect on well-being. And I do think the term well-being is perhaps better here than feeling good, because feeling good does suggest something rather fleeting, whereas what we're talking about is life satisfaction. And really, that's what matters to people. If they understand properly what does matter to them. I mean, obviously, some people will think it really matters to them how much they earn,
Right.
and they will spend their whole lives trying to maximize their income, and then realize at the end that it hasn't been worth it. But on the whole, I think people do understand that their well-being is what really does matter to them.
Right. And it's interesting to think of well-being as a policy lever. That's certainly a big topic of debate in the UK right now, but also I think amongst even in the United States. But also there's another debate here, which is around kind of safety of democracy. And I think, Jeffrey, you get into that a bit with the founders and this idea of the Federalist Papers as a kind of manual for public happiness. So I'm curious, Jeffrey, how you see the country faring on that right now.
It's so striking that the founders' main concern was demagogues who would flatter the people into seeking immediate gratification and in exchange for cheap luxuries would surrender liberty to a Caesar or a Cleon who would install himself as a president for life. And it's so striking to see both Jefferson and Hamilton fearing a demagogue. Jefferson actually fearing that in the future, an unscrupulous demagogue might lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, and refuse to leave office. Hamilton fearing that it would take the form of a Caesar. For both of them, personal self-government was necessary for political self-government unless citizens could resist the immediate gratification of owning the libs or owning the conservatives or choosing the most factionate candidate who would promise them immediate gratification, that the republic would fall. And that's why it's so striking to see Madison's definition of a faction, any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoting to self-interest rather than the public good. And that's why Washington, at the end of his life, says, without virtue, the republic will fall. And by virtue, he means virtuous self-mastery, learning the principles of liberty so you can defend them, and having the humility to engage in civil dialogue with those you disagree with, once again, resisting immediate gratification so that cool reason can slowly prevail. This is the very philosophy of the American system of government in America and around the world. We are seeing demagogues who are threatening to subvert democracy by flattering the people in precisely this way. And regardless of what you think about the nuances between hedonism and virtue ethics, which are really important, I would argue in this debate that the founders were correct, that unless citizens can muster that virtuous self-mastery and find personal self-government, then the republic will indeed risk falling to demagogues and authoritarians.
And so you're arguing that it really comes from the bottom up, particularly in this conception, that it is around personal self-regulation and the personal virtues. A virtuous leader, virtue defined by many principles kind of articulated by Jefferson, et cetera, including tranquility, silence, et cetera, that a virtuous leader is not enough. It needs to be a virtuous citizenry.
How can you achieve self-government on a wide scale unless citizens can literally govern themselves? And that's why Jefferson and Washington and all the founders are so keen on education. And they're not sure the experiment will survive. And in fact, many are quite pessimistic that the people won't find the virtuous self-regulation to take the time to educate themselves about the principles of liberty and to vote wisely. And that's why Madison is so excited about this new technology, the broadside press, that will allow citizens to publish complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers in the newspapers so that reason can slowly diffuse across the land. And in our world of Instagram and X or whatever it's called, and Enraged to Engage, and a media environment that's so polarizing and based on the very unreasonable passions that the founders most feared, there's a very serious question about whether or not the founders were too optimistic. And that's why it's so urgently important that citizens at this crucially challenging moment for democracy look to ourselves and try to find in ourselves the virtuous self-mastery that will be necessary to keep the republic.
Thank you for that, Jeffrey. It's very passionate on that topic and seems very urgent right now, given the stakes. Roger, I'm curious if you have a different perspective, if you think that kind of the pursuit of happiness is a bottom-up experiment, or if you kind of like Layard and others believe that there's policy, well-being, that could infuse a citizenry. It could be top-down some way.
No, I think once again, Jeffrey and I might agree at the substantive level. I think self-mastery is desirable, but not in itself. It's because people who have self-mastery and autonomy are happy. And there's a very strong correlation between good government and happiness or well-being.